Purgatory. Other serious problems with purgatory. The doctrine of purgatory errs in a number of other ways. It forgets that we have offended God's infinite justice. James says that even the smallest sin makes a sinner guilty of breaking all of the commandments. Why? Because any sin is rebellion against God, which separates the sinner from God for eternity. We are finite beings and could never pay the definite, infinite penalty demanded by God's justice. Consequently, there is no escape from hell, but the sinner must suffer there eternally. To expiate one's sins by suffering is therefore impossible. Of course, in theory, God could pay the infinite penalty demanded by his justice against sin. But that wouldn't be just, because he isn't one of us. He's righteous. He can't overlook sin. So God became man through the virgin birth, being a sinless man and an infinite God in one person. Christ was able to satisfy the claims of his own justice so that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. John 3:16. The only expiation of sin comes as a free gift of God's grace. And we know he's justified doing that because he, the God-man, in his humanity, paid for the sins of the whole world, and he qualified to do that. Any attempt to earn or merit it constitutes a rejection of God's offer of mercy to unworthy sinners. Moreover, the thought that there is any suffering at all left for a Christian to endure in payment of his sins, after Christ suffered the penalty and cried, "It is finished," is a blasphemous denial of the redemption that Christ effected and the salvation that he offers. Now, in the teaching of purgatory, we see once again that Roman Catholicism does not accept God's offer of salvation by his grace, unmerited favor, but insists upon adding human works to what Christ has done. Although Catholicism does affirm that salvation is ultimately by grace through faith, it also states that good works, though by God's grace operating in the individual, are essential for salvation, which contradicts itself. We quote again from Vatican II. From the most ancient times in the Church, good works were also offered to God for the salvation of sinners by the prayers and good works of holy people. The penitent was washed, cleansed, and redeemed. Following in Christ's steps, those who believe in him have always carried their crosses to make expiation for their own sins and the sins of others. But they're not qualified in order to help their brothers to obtain salvation from God. They're going around the corner. Flannery goes on to say, a fatal contradiction. Only blind submission to the Church prevents the Roman Catholic adherent from seeing that the doctrine of purgatory contains an obvious and fatal contradiction. On the one hand, we are told that the sacrifice of Christ is not enough to get one to heaven, but in addition to Christ's sufferings on the cross, the forgiven sinner must himself suffer torment to be purged of his sin. On the other hand, however, and in direct contradiction, it is said that the Mass, which is representation or perpetual renewal of Christ's sacrifice, reduces by some unknown amount one's suffering. Presumably, if enough Masses were said, one would be purged by the expiation of all sins without suffering at all. So one doesn't have to offer, after all, to be purged. If one truly had to suffer before heaven's gate would open, the church would have nothing to offer and would lose a major means of income. The same would be true if Christ's sacrifice for sin, as the Bible teaches, were enough to purge the sinner. The Catholic Church would again be out of business. Therefore, to keep the church operating and its coffers full, it is taught that one may be purged of sin by certain means which the church can provide, and that Christ's sacrifice on the cross was insufficient to purge of sin, so that the Mass, for which the church receives income, can be credited with reducing suffering in purgatory and opening the gate of heaven. So Jesus Christ is inept. He didn't quietly do it. He didn't do enough. How amazing that what Christ's suffering on the cross could not effect, the alleged repetition of that suffering reenacted on Catholic altars can accomplish. How arrogant, not how amazing. Moreover, the sufferings of others also are said to reduce the time needed for purging in purgatory. The stigma of Padre Pio and the sufferings of the saints can thus accomplish what the sacrifice of Christ on the cross could not. Here it is again. Quote, following in Christ's steps, those who believe in him have always carried their crosses to make expiation for their own sins and the sins of others. Not only have they make expiation for their own sins, but they have got so much good in them, they can make payment for the sins of others. I guess we don't need Jesus. Christ's cross could only forgive, but could not purge sin. How do you do the both? Comment. Interesting contradiction. How can one be forgiven of sin, yet still not purged from sin? Yet the crosses carried by others can purge sin, and thus can do more than the cross of Christ? So the doctrine of purgatory contains a fatal contradiction. It declares that one must suffer in order to be purged of one's sins. Yet at the same time it says one need not suffer if certain rules are followed. Got a few bucks in your wallet? The major means of escaping suffering is through the repetition of the Mass, but there are many others. The reduction of or elimination of suffering in purgatory is also effected through indulgences. So, I think I've read enough.